There are some books in the Bible that feel ancient the moment you open them, and Esther is certainly one of them. The names are old, the setting is imperial, the customs are foreign, the politics are layered, and the world it describes can seem very far from our own. And yet, if you read Esther carefully, it begins to feel unsettlingly current. That is one of the reasons this book matters so much. It is ancient, yes, but it is also contemporary in the way only Scripture can be. It takes us into the Persian Empire, into the region we would now associate with Iran, into the orbit of the Persian Gulf, into a world where decrees are issued, empires posture, Jews live under threat, and rulers speak in terms that sound chillingly familiar to anyone paying attention to the modern world. Esther may be old, but it is not dusty. It speaks into headlines as well as history. And that is one of the first things we should notice. The book of Esther unfolds in the Persian world in the very general region that is, again, so often in the news. In the ancient story, there is an edict aimed at annihilating the Jewish people. In our modern world, voices from that same broad region have repeatedly called for the destruction of Israel. So while we must be careful not to flatten ancient Persia into modern Iran as though nothing has changed, we would also be naive if we missed the resonance. The old hatred has a familiar sound. The old hostility has modern echoes. And because of that, Esther feels less like a museum artifact and more like a living, breathing reminder that the struggles surrounding God's people are never as distant as we sometimes imagine. Now, before we even get into the story itself, we need to understand how the Jews ended up here in the first place. They did not wake up one morning and decide Persia seemed like a nice place to relocate. They were there because of discipline, because of history, because of covenant failure, and because God had allowed his people to be carried away into exile. Judah fell to Babylon in 586 BC when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem and carried the people off. Earlier still, the northern kingdom had already been taken by Assyria. So over time, Jewish communities became scattered throughout the great empires of the East. Babylon had ruled the world. Then Babylon fell, just as Daniel 5 foretold, and the Medo-Persian Empire took its place. The Jews who had been under Babylonian domination now found themselves living under Persian domination. Same exile, different empire. And here is where the story becomes especially interesting. By the time Esther opens, some Jews had already been permitted to return to their homeland. Zerubbabel had already led a group back to Jerusalem. The door was open. The Persians had allowed it. And yet, most of the Jews did not go. That is a crucial detail. Under 50,000 returned, but many, perhaps well over 1 million by some estimates, remained scattered throughout the empire. Why? Because exile had become familiar. Babylon and Persia had become normal. They had built lives there, raised families there, formed routines there, and perhaps said to themselves, why go back to a broken city with burned gates, hard conditions, and uncertainty? In other words, they had become comfortable in a compromised place. And that already begins to make Esther feel very relevant, because it is always possible for the people of God to get so used to life in the wrong setting that they lose the urgency of returning to what God originally intended. Now that gives us the setting for the book. Esther is not primarily about the Jews who returned. It is about the Jews who remained, the Jews still living in Persia, the Jews who had settled in the empire, built their lives there, and now found themselves vulnerable inside a pagan political world. That is where the whole drama unfolds. And it is one reason the book has such tremendous value for believers even now. Because many Christians know what it is to live in a place, institution, system or culture that feels spiritually foreign, morally compromised, or deeply frustrating. They ask, why would God have me here? Why am I in this workplace? Why am I in this environment? Why am I in this chapter? Esther reminds us that God wastes nothing. He does not waste locations. He does not waste placements. He does not waste uncomfortable chapters. He does not waste even compromised environments when he intends to display his providence in them. That brings us to one of the most important words for understanding Esther: providence. In many ways, providence is the signature theme of the whole book. And that is fascinating because Esther is the one biblical book where God is never mentioned by name, not once. Prayer is not explicitly mentioned. The Mosaic Law is not highlighted. The New Testament never directly quotes Esther. Martin Luther himself disliked the book and wished it had never been written. But I think Luther was wrong there, badly wrong. Because if you focus only on what Esther does not contain, you will miss the very brilliance of what it does contain. God's name may be absent from the surface of the book, but his handprint is all over it. He is everywhere without being named. He is acting without announcing himself. He is weaving without stepping onto center stage. That is providence. And I love the way the source message explains this with 4 words: appearance, maintenance, interference, and providence. Sometimes God works by appearance. He just shows up in unmistakable ways, as in a theophany or direct manifestation. Sometimes he works by maintenance, holding the universe together, sustaining the ordinary structures of creation, as Colossians says, in him all things consist. Sometimes he works by interference, what we usually call miracle, where he supersedes natural processes, as in resurrection, walking on water, or direct supernatural intervention. But most commonly, God works by providence. And providence means he uses ordinary, natural events to accomplish supernatural purposes. He does not always break the rules of nature. Often he bends the normal flow of life so precisely that only later do you look back and realize God was in all of that. He was positioning, arranging, restraining, opening, delaying, moving, and weaving. That is Esther from beginning to end. You usually do not see providence while it is happening. That is part of the challenge. Miracles are obvious, providence often is not. Providence looks like coincidence while you are living inside it. Only later, from a different angle, do you see how the puzzle pieces fit together. That is why Esther is such an important book for discouraged people. Because a discouraged person often judges life by one chapter, one setback, one environment, one season of silence. But Esther teaches you to wait until the end of the book before deciding what God is doing. He may seem absent while he is actually arranging everything. He may seem silent while he is actually speaking through events. He may seem inactive while he is placing every right person in every right place at every right time. Now, with that in mind, we come to the opening verse. It came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. This is not a small kingdom. This is not a local ruler with a narrow jurisdiction. This is the Persian Empire at its height, a massive landmass stretching from India in the east to Ethiopia in the south and westward up through Asia Minor and beyond. It is one of the great world-ruling empires of antiquity. And the man called Ahasuerus here is most famously known to history by his Greek name, Xerxes. He is the son of Darius and the father of Artaxerxes, which means he sits in a crucial place in the chronology of biblical history. Esther's story fits between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7, between the earlier return under Zerubbabel and the later mission of Ezra. In other words, While some Jews are back in Jerusalem beginning the slow work of restoration, this whole drama is unfolding among the Jews who remained in Persia. Verse 2 tells us the king was sitting on his throne in Shushan, the citadel. Shushan, or Susa, was one of the royal capitals of Persia, really the winter palace. The Persians had multiple palaces because they moved with the seasons. No air conditioning, no central heating, so different locations suited different times of year. Shushan was the winter capital, and it is here that the drama begins, not with prayer, not with crisis, not with Jews at all, but with imperial excess. In the 3rd year of his reign, Ahasuerus throws a feast for his officials, servants, nobles, princes, and military powers, and this feast lasts 180 days, 6 months. That is not a dinner party. That is not even a festival. That is an empire-wide propaganda event dressed as celebration. And that is exactly what it was. Xerxes had suffered defeats against the Greeks and needed to rally support, project strength, reassure the nobles, and sell a renewed military vision. So he stages 6 months of opulence to remind everyone how glorious Persia still is. Mark that carefully. The book opens with outward splendor covering inward insecurity. That happens a lot in political history. Empires often become loudest in self-display when they are most threatened underneath. Xerxes is trying to persuade everyone, perhaps even himself, that he is still magnificent, still in control, still worth following into another campaign. And what better way to do that than a display of riches, luxury, endless food, wine, ornaments, marble, gold, silver, and spectacle? Then comes the after party. The 6-month feast ends, and the king hosts another feast lasting 7 days for everyone in Shushan, from great to small. Here the description gets even more lavish. White and blue linen curtains, fine cords, silver rods, marble pillars, golden and silver couches, mosaic pavement, royal wine in abundance. Each guest drinking from uniquely crafted golden vessels. It is excessive, extravagant, almost cartoonishly imperial, and yet the point is not merely that Persia was wealthy. The point is that the king is performing his greatness. He is staging majesty. He is trying to create awe. And that too sets the tone for the book. Human power is always trying to look ultimate. It throws parties, issues, edicts, displays splendor, and assumes it controls the future. But the reader already knows something the king does not know. There is another king at work in the story. And his rule requires no marble pillars to make itself real. So the opening movement of Esther gives us the frame. An empire at its peak, a ruler with immense power, a scattered Jewish people living far from home, and a book where God seems absent yet is already unmistakably at work. That is the stage. In the next movement, the story will begin tightening around the king's household itself, around Queen Vashti, around pride, anger, and decisions that look political on the surface but are already setting the stage for Providence to move. Now the story begins to tighten. Because after the wide-angle shot of imperial Persia, of vast provinces, royal opulence, and 6-month displays of power, the camera moves inward. It moves from the empire to the palace, from the palace to the feast, and from the feast to a moment of private pride that will suddenly become public crisis. That is often how providence works. God does not always begin by shaking the whole world at once. Sometimes he starts with one decision in one room, one wounded ego, one refusal, one conversation, one decree, and from that single thread, he begins weaving events that will eventually determine the future of nations. That is exactly what happens here. A king drinks too much, pride swells too high, and a queen says no, and history begins to bend. Verse 8 tells us that the drinking at this feast was not compulsory, because the king had ordered that each man could drink according to his pleasure. In other words, the wine was flowing freely, the atmosphere was indulgent, and the king was making sure everyone could enjoy the bounty of Persia as lavishly as they wished. Then we are told that Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace. That detail is easy to pass by, but it is important because it reflects Persian custom. Men and women of the royal household did not normally party together in that setting. The king hosted the men, the queen hosted the women. The men could drink, boast, and indulge themselves while the women remained separate. And that is the arrangement, at least until the king decides he wants to collapse that boundary for the sake of his own vanity. Verse 10 says, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine. That is one of the Bible's polite ways of saying he was drunk. The party has been going, the indulgence has reached its climax, and Xerxes Ahasuerus is no longer operating from sober judgment. He calls for 7 eunuchs who serve in his presence and commands them to bring Queen Vashti before the assembled men wearing her royal crown to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. Now, the text itself says she was to come wearing the crown, and Jewish tradition goes further, suggesting that she was to wear the crown and only the crown, presented before a room full of drunken men as an object of display. Whether or not every detail of that tradition is correct, the point is clear enough. The king is not honoring his queen. He is showcasing her. He is turning her into part of the entertainment. And here, surprisingly, power meets resistance. Verse 12 says, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command. That is a remarkable line. In the ancient Persian court, to refuse the king, especially publicly, especially in the context of an official command, was not a small thing. It was dangerous. It was costly. And on a purely human level, you almost have to admire her courage. Whatever else may be true about Vashti, and we should be careful not to romanticize her too much because the text does not turn her into a saint on this point. She does something undeniably strong. She refuses to be paraded for the gratification of drunk men. She says no to the command of the most powerful man in the world, at least within that imperial orbit. That is no small act. Now, what happens next tells you a great deal about the kind of king Xerxes was. Therefore, the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. Of course it did. Proud men never take public embarrassment well. And the source material reminds us that Xerxes was known historically for violent, impulsive anger. He was the kind of man who, after a bridge over the Hellespont was destroyed by a storm, symbolically lashed the sea and then executed the men who had built the bridge. That is not the behavior of a stable, measured soul. It is the behavior of a ruler drunk not only on wine but on power. So when Vashti refuses him, he does not merely feel disappointed, he burns, because a despot can tolerate here many things more easily than the humiliation of being told no in front of his audience. But now the scene becomes almost darkly comic in the way fallen power often does. Xerxes does not simply calm down and think clearly. He brings in the wise men, the legal experts, the princes of Persia and Media, the men who know law and justice. In other words, he turns a wounded ego into a constitutional matter. He asks, what shall we do to Queen Vashti according to law? That is how pride often clothes itself in the language of principle, policy, and legal necessity. A personal insult becomes a matter of national stability. An offended man becomes a defender of order. And that is exactly the spin his advisors immediately give him. Memucan, one of the princes, steps forward and says, in effect, the queen has not only wronged the king, but all the princes and all the people in all the provinces. That is absurd, of course, but it is politically useful absurdity. If this is allowed, he says, all women everywhere will hear of it, despise their husbands, and domestic rebellion will sweep the empire. So what begins as one woman refusing one degrading command is inflated into a civilization-threatening crisis. That is spin, that is political theater, that is insecure male power trying to legislate respect because it cannot command it morally. And notice how quickly the proposed solution appears. Let a royal decree be written in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, laws which cannot be altered, that Vashti may never again come before the king, and let her royal position be given to another who is better than she. Then, Memucan says, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. It is laughable in one sense, tragic in another. Here is a man trying to stabilize the empire by issuing a decree that every husband must be master in his own house. Imagine needing a global imperial edict to secure your authority at home. That alone tells you how brittle the whole structure is. Power that has to announce itself this loudly is usually more fragile than it appears. Now, however ridiculous the decree may seem, there is something important happening under the surface. The law of the Medes and Persians, once written, could not easily be overturned, not even by the king himself. We have seen that principle elsewhere, especially in Daniel. That means what looks like one drunken overreaction will now become an irreversible legal step. And that step matters because it removes Vashti and opens a vacancy at the very top of the kingdom. The throne beside the throne is now empty. The queen is gone. The crown will need another head. And though no one in the room knows it yet, Providence is already moving. God is using the king's vanity, the queen's refusal, the advisor's political nonsense, and the rigidity of Persian law to clear a place for Esther. That is providence. No miracle, no voice from heaven, no fire from the sky. Just a chain of very human actions being bent toward a divine outcome. That is one of the great lessons of Esther. God does not need holy motives in every actor to accomplish a holy purpose. He is not approving the drunkenness, the lust, the anger, the absurdity, or the pride. He is overruling them. That is different. He is so sovereign that he can let sinful people act according to their sinful desires and still weave the result into his own larger plan. That is not endorsement, it is mastery. It means providence is not fragile. It does not depend on human goodness to keep God's plan alive. He can work through vanity as surely as through virtue, through decrees as surely as through prayer, through the palace as surely as through the temple. And I think that is where this part of the book becomes very practical for us. There are moments when your life seems to be controlled by the decisions of foolish people. A boss makes a bad call. A leader acts out of ego. A system bends under vanity. A relationship gets altered by someone else's pride. And in those moments, it can look as though everything is now being determined by the most unstable person in the room. Esther reminds you to look deeper. God may not be named in the moment, but he is not absent from it. He may be doing 10 things beneath the surface while everyone else is simply reacting to the obvious one. Vashti is removed. Xerxes thinks he is protecting his honor. Memucan thinks he is preserving social order, but heaven is making room for Esther. So chapter 1 closes with letters being sent throughout the empire in every script and every language, declaring that every man should be master in his own house. It is a decree born from insecurity, inflated by politics, and spread by imperial machinery. And yet even that foolishness becomes part of the stage setting for redemption. The king thinks he is restoring order. He is actually preparing the story. The advisors think they are saving male authority. They are actually making room for a Jewish orphan girl whose name means star. That is how Providence works. The actors do not know the script, but God does. And in the next movement, the story will move from Vashti's fall to Esther's rise. The empire will begin searching for a new queen. And what will look like a beauty contest will in fact become one more layer in the hidden plan of God. That is where the mystery deepens. Because the girl chosen for the throne will not be Persian royalty at all, but a Jewish exile being quietly raised by her cousin Mordecai. Now the story moves from the fall of Vashti to the rise of Esther. And this is where the providence of God becomes even more fascinating. Because what looks on the surface like a beauty pageant is actually a providential placement. After chapter 1 closes, there is a gap of several years. During that time, Xerxes goes off to continue his campaign against the Greeks, and as history tells us, he loses again. The great king who threw a 6-month feast to project confidence comes home humiliated, diminished, and no doubt feeling the sting of his failures. And when he returns, the text says, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti. In other words, now that the wine has worn off and the anger has cooled down, memory returns. Regret comes back. The king remembers what he did, what she did, and what had been decreed against her. He is now trapped by his own law. That is often how pride works. In the moment, it feels strong. Later, it feels foolish, but by then, the consequences are already in motion. So the king's servants come up with a plan. Since Vashti is gone and cannot be restored, let beautiful young virgins be gathered from all the provinces of the empire. Bring them to Shushan. Place them under the care of the king's eunuch. Give them beauty treatments. Let the one who pleases the king become queen instead of Vashti. And the text says, this thing pleased the king, and he did so. Of course it pleased him. It appealed to vanity, appetite, and power all at once. But what matters for us is not merely the king's motivation. What matters is what God is about to do through a system that seems entirely secular, political, and morally compromised. The Lord is about to place the right person in the right place at the right time, and he is going to do it through a process that nobody would call sacred on the surface. That is providence again. And now we meet the two figures who will carry the heart of the story forward, Mordecai and Esther. In Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, a Benjamite. He is then traced back through his ancestry, and we are told that his line had been carried away from Jerusalem. Then we read that Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is, Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. Here the story becomes deeply personal. We are not just dealing with empires, edicts, and palace politics anymore. We are now dealing with an orphan girl being raised by a relative in exile, and that matters because Scripture so often loves to place the weak, the vulnerable, and the seemingly insignificant right in the center of God's hidden purposes. Now, her Hebrew name is Hadassah, which means myrtle, like the fragrant, flowering tree used in Jewish life and worship. Her Persian name is Esther, meaning star. That is fitting, because she is the star of the book in the narrative sense, even while God remains the true hidden star behind the whole plot, it is also worth noting that both Mordecai and Esther bear names that reflect life in exile. Esther's Persian name is related linguistically to Ishtar, a pagan goddess. Mordecai's name may echo Marduk, another deity of that world. That alone tells you something about the environment they were living in. These are covenant people carrying the marks of Persian culture. They are Jews, yes, but Jews in exile, shaped by the setting they inhabit, compromised in some ways, accommodated in others, yet still under the providential care of God. We are then told that Esther was lovely and beautiful, and when her parents died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. There is tenderness in that sentence. In the middle of all the imperial machinery, all the excess, all the politics, we are told about an orphan girl and the man who raises her. Mordecai is more than a cousin in function. He becomes a father figure. He adopts responsibility. He protects. He nurtures. And that relational tenderness matters because when the crisis of the book unfolds later, it will not merely be a political problem. It will be deeply personal for both of them. Mordecai is not maneuvering some distant stranger onto the throne. He is watching over a girl he has loved, raised, and guarded. Now here is where the moral complexity of Esther begins to show. Esther is taken into the king's palace, into the custody of Haggai, the keeper of the women, and we naturally ask, how could this happen? Why would Mordecai allow it? Why would Esther enter such a setting? And the answer is not entirely neat, which is perhaps part of the point. First, this is Persia. When the king wants, the king gets. There is coercive power in the background of all of this. Second, the Jews in Persia are clearly not living in a state of ideal covenant faithfulness. They are not in Jerusalem. They are not organized around temple life. They are not living in obvious spiritual strength. They are in exile, compromised to varying degrees, settled into a pagan environment, navigating a world of mixed loyalties and blurred lines. That does not excuse everything, but it does help explain the moral texture of the book. Esther is not Daniel in Babylon refusing defilement at the first table. Esther is a different kind of story, murkier, quieter, more hidden, more entangled in the ambiguities of life in exile. Yet even in that murkiness, providence is at work. Esther is taken. The young woman pleases Haggai. She obtains favor. He gives her beauty preparations, special treatment, 7 choice maidservants, and the best place in the house of the women. Already favor is gathering around her. And that too is a providential pattern in Scripture. Joseph finds favor in Egypt. Daniel finds favor in Babylon. Nehemiah finds favor before Artaxerxes. Esther finds favor here. When God intends to move someone into position, He often causes favor to settle on them in the eyes of the people around them. That favor does not remove the strangeness of the setting. It does not make the environment holy. But it does signal that the hidden hand of God is positioning His servant for something still to come. Now Mordecai gives Esther a specific instruction. Do not reveal your people or your kindred. In other words, do not tell them you are Jewish. Again, the setting is complicated. On one hand, the Persians had allowed Jewish returns to Jerusalem. On the other hand, as the story soon makes painfully clear, there is an undercurrent of anti-Jewish hostility in the empire waiting to surface. Mordecai seems to sense that. Maybe it is prudence. Maybe it is fear. Maybe it is compromise. Likely some mixture of all three. But the fact remains, Esther's identity is hidden at the beginning of the story. The queen-to-be is a concealed Jew. And that hiddenness itself becomes part of God's providential design, because had her identity been fully obvious from the beginning, the story later would have unfolded very differently. Again, God is not named, but he is arranging. Then we get one of the more striking details in the whole chapter. Each young woman underwent 12 months of beauty preparations before going in to the king. 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics, an entire year of preparation. That is astonishing. It tells you how elaborate, artificial, and court-centered the entire system was. This is imperial luxury at its most excessive. Yet what is fascinating is that when Esther's turn comes, she requests nothing except what Haggai advises. She does not overload herself with ornament. She does not seem to rely on spectacle. She goes in with a kind of natural restraint and once again obtains favor in the sight of all who see her. There is something in Esther that shines without self-advertising. That too becomes important. Providence often works quietly. It does not always need flash. And then the decisive line comes, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. There it is. The orphan girl from exile becomes queen of Persia. The Jewish girl with the hidden identity is now sitting beside the ruler of the greatest empire on earth. Nobody in that moment sees the full meaning of what has just happened. The king thinks he has simply found a woman who pleases him. The court thinks a beauty contest has concluded. Esther herself may not yet understand why this has happened, but heaven knows. God has just moved the most important piece on the board into place. That is providence. A crown is placed on her head, but providence placed her there first. And then, as if to underline that providence is working on more than one front at once, the chapter closes with another crucial thread. Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate, and while there, he overhears 2 of the king's eunuchs plotting to assassinate Ahasuerus. He tells Esther. Esther tells the king in Mordecai's name. The matter is investigated. The conspirators are executed, and the event is written in the official chronicles. Now, at first glance, that might seem like an odd little footnote tacked on to the end of the chapter. But it is not a footnote. It is one more providential thread. Mordecai saves the king's life, yet receives no reward, not yet. The king forgets. The court moves on. The account is simply written down. But the reader is supposed to notice that delayed reward is not a loose end. It is a loaded gun hanging on the wall, waiting for the right chapter. And this is where Esther becomes such a comfort to anyone living in the tension of an unresolved life. Because chapter 2 ends with a hidden Jew on the throne, a faithful man overlooked at the gate, a king preserved without gratitude, and a danger not yet fully visible but quietly approaching. In other words, nothing looks resolved yet. Everything looks half-finished, incomplete, almost accidental. But that is exactly how providence often feels while you are living inside it. The reward has not come yet. The reason is not clear yet. The danger is not obvious yet. The purpose is not visible yet. But God has already put the right people in the right places. He is writing the answer before anyone knows the full question. So in this chapter, we see Esther rise, Mordecai serve, and the empire unknowingly prepare the very conditions by which God will later preserve his people. That is the beauty of providence. It works ahead of crisis. It puts Esther in the palace before the decree is written. It lets Mordecai uncover the plot before the king needs to remember his name. It arranges what seems incidental now so that it will become essential later. And in the next movement, the danger that has so far stayed mostly beneath the surface will finally step into view in the form of one of the most infamous villains in Scripture, Haman. And now, the danger finally steps out of the shadows and takes a name. Up to this point in Esther, the tension has been mostly quiet, mostly hidden, mostly structural. A king has thrown parties, a queen has been removed, Esther has been elevated, Mordecai has uncovered a plot, and all along the providence of God has been quietly at work behind the curtain. But chapter 3 and beyond will soon make clear that there is a darker force rising inside the empire, personal hatred, political manipulation, and the ancient hostility against the covenant people of God concentrated in one man. His name is Haman. And if Esther teaches us anything at this point, it is that God often positions his people before the danger becomes visible. He prepares the answer before the question is fully asked. He moves Esther to the throne before Haman ever drafts his edict. He places Mordecai at the gate before the king will one day need to remember him. Providence is always ahead of the crisis. That is one of the great comforts of this book. God does not wait for the emergency to begin planning. He is never scrambling. He is never reacting in panic to what evil men decide to do. Long before Haman begins his schemes, God has already been arranging the palace, the crown, the gate, the hidden identity, the overheard conversation, the written record, the delay in reward, the king's emotional instability, even the vanity and foolishness of the court. All of it is being woven, which means the book of Esther is not just a story about Jewish survival in Persia. It is a story about how thoroughly, quietly, and masterfully God governs the details of history. Not loudly, not theatrically, often not obviously, but really. And that is why Esther is such an important book for discouraged people. Because there are seasons in life when God seems absent precisely because he is not dramatic, he is not splitting seas, he is not sending fire from heaven, he is not writing messages on walls, he is not opening the earth or raising the dead in front of us. He seems silent. And when he seems silent, people are tempted to think he must also be inactive. Esther corrects that. Esther says silence does not mean absence. Hiddenness does not mean weakness. Unnamed does not mean uninvolved. In fact, sometimes God is doing his finest work precisely when his name is not the most visible thing in the scene. He is weaving natural events towards supernatural ends. He is governing ordinary details so that when the decisive hour comes, his purpose will already be in place. That has profound implications for the way we read our own lives. Many people judge their whole story by one chapter. They judge by the chapter where they are stuck in a secular job they do not enjoy, or the chapter where the environment around them feels compromised and spiritually dry, or the chapter where they cannot see why God would place them where they are, or the chapter where they feel unseen, delayed, unrewarded, or strangely out of step with what they imagined life would be. But Esther warns us against that kind of judgment. Do not judge the whole story by one chapter. Wait for the end of the book. Mordecai in chapter 2 looks like a faithful man who saved the king and was promptly forgotten. Esther looks like a beautiful orphan caught in the machinery of a pagan empire. But neither of those chapter 2 readings tells you the whole truth. God is writing more. And that is where Mordecai's later words to Esther become so important, even though we have not fully arrived there yet. Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? That line only lands with force because chapters 1 and 2 have already shown us how unlikely her position was. She did not seize the throne by personal strategy. She was carried there by a chain of events she did not control. Vashti's refusal, Xerxes' foolishness, Persian law, the search for a queen, favor in the palace, hidden identity, the king's delight, all of it moved her toward a place that at first may have seemed merely strange or even compromising, but later it will be revealed as providential. In other words, the place you least understand today may be the very place from which God intends to use you tomorrow. That is why I think one of the great practical lessons of Esther is the value of the believer in the workplace, in the institution, in the system, in the place that feels secular, complicated, or less than ideal. God never wastes a life. He never wastes a placement. He never wastes an opportunity. You may feel like you are just answering phones, processing paperwork, teaching classes, sitting in meetings, raising children in an obscure corner of the world, working a job you did not dream of, or enduring an environment you never would have chosen. And the temptation is to say, surely God could not possibly have much use for this. Esther says otherwise. God may be writing a chapter whose meaning you will not understand until much later. The ordinary may be the staging ground of providence. Now, let us also notice something else. Esther and Mordecai are not presented as perfectly heroic from the very beginning. They are complicated. They are Jews in exile living with compromise and concealment. Esther hides her identity. Mordecai seems to accept far more of Persian life than Daniel ever did in Babylon. In other words, this is not a story about spotless saints gliding through history untouched by the world around them. It is a story about God working through imperfect people in morally complicated circumstances that should both humble and encourage us. It humbles us because we cannot turn Esther into a simplistic morality tale where only the obviously righteous get used by God. But it encourages us because it means God's providence is not so fragile that it depends on our flawless clarity at every point. He can work through imperfect saints, mixed motives, and half-understood circumstances. That does not excuse compromise. It magnifies providence. And then there is the bigger historical perspective that the source message hinted at so beautifully. Persia itself, for all its splendor, is not ultimate. Greece is already rising in the background. Xerxes thinks he is the center of the world, but history is already moving beyond him. Philip of Macedon and then Alexander the Great will reshape the ancient world. Greek language, Greek roads, Greek culture, and later Roman consolidation will help create the very conditions in which, centuries later, the gospel can spread rapidly through the ancient world. Paul can say in Galatians, when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son. Because God had been preparing that fullness across generations, empires, languages, roads, wars, and political shifts. Even here in Esther, long before Christ's incarnation, the stage of world history is already being arranged. Providence is never local only, it is cosmic. God governs kings while preparing a cradle. That means the same God who is arranging Esther's rise, Mordecai's delay, and Haman's eventual downfall is also arranging the world for redemption. Persia thinks it is writing imperial policy. Greece thinks it will write cultural destiny. Rome will think it is imposing political order. But above all of them stands the God who is preparing the fullness of time. That is one reason. Esther feels so rich theologically, even though God is never named. The whole book assumes a God who is sovereign enough to govern the powerful without announcing himself in every paragraph. He is the hidden king above the visible kings. So let us gather the book so far. Chapter 1 gives us a king drunk on power, a queen who refuses humiliation, and a foolish decree that opens the throne. Chapter 2 gives us an orphan girl raised by her cousin, brought into the palace, crowned as queen, and a faithful gatekeeper who saves the king's life but goes unrewarded. At every turn, what appears to be mere palace politics is actually providential preparation. And the lesson is clear. When God seems hidden, he may be most deeply at work. When life looks most ordinary, he may be arranging the extraordinary. When you cannot yet explain the chapter you are in, that does not mean the author has stopped writing. It means you are not yet at the end of the story. And that leaves us with a deeply personal question. Where in your life are you tempted to assume that God is absent simply because he is not obvious? Where have you concluded that a placement is meaningless, a delay is pointless, a silence is empty, or a season is wasted? Esther whispers back across the centuries, wait, watch, trust. The hand of God may be on the page even when his name is not printed in bold. He may be setting up an answer you cannot yet see. He may be moving you toward a for such a time as this moment that will only make sense later. Providence is often clearest in retrospect, but it is no less real while it is still unfolding. So the opening chapters of Esther give us a powerful foundation. God's providence is real. He governs empires. He uses kings, queens, exiles, orphans, eunuchs, decrees, delays, and even foolish political theater to accomplish his will. He does not waste lives. He does not waste chapters. He does not waste placements. And if that is true in the Persian court, it is true in your life too. If that is the desire of your heart, then right where you are, you can pray something like this. Lord, teach me to trust your providence even when I cannot see your hand clearly. Forgive me for the times I judge my story too quickly and mistake your silence for your absence. Help me to believe that you are working through ordinary events, difficult placements, delays, and hidden seasons for your good purposes. Place me where you want me. Use me when you are ready. And give me patience to trust the end of the story before I understand this chapter. In Jesus' name, amen.